everyone. Wow, what an amazing crowd, despite the constant snow we've had tonight. Thank you all so much for coming out. My name is Amali, and I'm the events director here at Books Are Magic. We are so excited to have Regan, Penaluna, and Ada Calhoun with us tonight to celebrate the launch of Regan's debut book, How to Think Like a Woman. But before we get into all of that, I just have a few logistics to point out for how tonight's event is going to go. First off, for all of you out in the audience, we do ask that you wear a mask at all times while at this event. We've got plenty of extras up at the front where you checked in. We will be doing a hand-raised audience Q&A towards the end of tonight's event, so please start thinking of questions to ask and hold on to them. After tonight's talk, Regan will be signing and personalizing books at the desk behind me near our side door. We, of course, have additional books available for purchase, also at the desk that you checked in. And lastly, if you're joining us virtually on the YouTube live stream, we would love to encourage you to buy a copy of How to Think Like a Woman online using the link in the live stream description. All right, let's get into this. In How to Think Like a Woman, memoir meets history, meets philosophy, meets cultural commentary, and so much more. Through the forgotten writings of 4 female philosophers, Regan re-examines her experiences in academia, her love and commitment to the study of philosophy, the universal search for truth and love, and so many more things. We just cannot wait to hear what more Regan has to say about it tonight. Regan Penaluna is a writer and journalist based here in Brooklyn. Previously, she was an editor at Nautilus magazine and Guernica, where she wrote and edited long-form stories and interviews. As I mentioned earlier, Ada Calhoun joins Regan in conversation tonight. Ada is the author of St. Mark's is Dead, Wedding Toasts I'll Never Give, and Why We Can't Sleep. She has written for the New York Times, New Republic, and the Washington Post. All right, that's all from me. Without any further delay, please join me in welcoming Ada and Regan.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Oh, it's wonderful to be here. A debut. It's a debut, everybody. We love a debut.
Yeah.
And such an amazing one. This book is so incredible. Who's already read it? Have some people? Okay, handful of people. Partially. Okay. Well, there's a story there. It's amazing. Isn't it amazing? I've hand sold this book to so many people. I was just at in Scotland, and somebody was railing against the fact there were only Dan Brown books in the Roslyn Chapel gift store, and she was like, "Why isn't this book here?" So you need to be in the Roslyn Chapel gift store. Okay, so we're going to want to leave lots of time for questions and conversation, but I thought, Regan, maybe you could just start by saying, like, you moved here to New York when you were 31.
Correct.
And could you paint a picture of your life back then?
So I was 31 years old, and I had just divorced. I was a full-time professor at a college in the Midwest in my home state of Iowa. And I knew I had to change my life. And the divorce was part of this, and moving to New York was part of this. I had a very good friend who said, "You must come to New York and try it out." And so I did. And it was actually Carroll Gardens that I came to. And so I came, and I decided to continue teaching in academia, and I found a job, and I was trying to work out what I wanted to do. What should I continue in academia? I had been frustrated for a number of reasons. One of them was the sexism and misogyny that I encountered in the great texts of philosophers, and also in my personal experience over a decade of being in academia.
I think at this point we need a horror story about your life in academia, and why is it a difficult place to be a woman, and in what ways is it difficult in different ways than other places where it is difficult to be a woman?
So my department had just experienced a scandal, a sexual harassment scandal when I arrived as a first-year graduate student in a PhD program in philosophy. And I didn't think too much about it. situation seemed, in fact, to be promising in that people were aware, and this professor had left the university. However, I found that there are other forms of misogyny and sexism, and I thought I could rise above these sorts of situations until one day I found myself in a class taught by a famous philosopher, and it was a course that I was really excited to take about Plato, and the professor arrived to class this day, and he plunked down a thick stack of papers, and he said, "Today, I want to ask you a question. I want you to set aside any political correctness, because we are philosophers, and as such, we are after objectivity, and sometimes that doesn't reflect what people feel is polite." And he said, "Why is it that there are so few women in philosophy?" And of course, I knew this at the time. I knew this going into philosophy. I knew it was the field of dead white men. This is what I'd been told. And sure enough, all the texts I was reading were written by dead white men. And everyone I was encountering, nearly everyone, was a male. But he said, "Well, why is it there are so few women?" And I'm looking around the room, and there's me and one other woman. And everyone's kind of looking at us. We're looking at each other. And but I didn't have a response, and I knew what he was getting at, which was perhaps the reason there aren't many women in philosophy is not because they haven't been given opportunity. It's simply because they're inferior. And I did not have a response, and I felt crushed. But I had never taken a course in feminist philosophy. I'd never read even a woman philosopher, right? Not all women philosophers have to talk about feminist philosophy, but I'd never been exposed to either in my graduate program. So I was flummoxed. And that, I walked out of that class and I felt ashamed. I felt ashamed for having no response whatsoever. And so over the next few years, I started to develop a response to that.
Yes, and well done. Revenge, a dish best served cold, and here it is. It's an amazing book, and one of the great things that you do is you fill these gaps in the canon, right? You answer this question, like, where are the women? And you have a very clear and very elegant answer, and you propose these 4 philosophers who, I'm ashamed I didn't know a whole lot about, and it was such a joy to learn about them through your eyes. I also just want to say that the weaving of memoir with these histories and this information is just really just incredible and beautiful, and so it's enjoyable, even if you don't have an interest in philosophy, just to read the story of one woman and her journey through the world is really riveting. So okay, let's talk about the four philosophers.
Sounds great.
Shall we?
Let's do it. Let's dive in.
We'll do one at a time. So let's start with Astel.
Sure. So Mary Astel was born in 1666, the year of Satan, and she was naughty. She was born into a coal mining family of the gentry, so she was well off in many ways. Her uncle tutored her in philosophy because her brother was being tutored, and he looked over and saw that she seemed relatively bright and brought her into the fold. And that was relatively common for the gentry. What happened is her father, his business started to fail as the mines were running low, and it became very clear to her around age 12 that she wouldn't have a dowry. And without a dowry, as a young woman of the gentry, things aren't looking good for your future. Not looking good for your future if you study at all. It will mean you'll have to marry below you and do more drudgery. And so what happened at age 12 is her father died, and she had nothing to look forward to. And so a year later, her uncle died, and Mary became a very melancholic teenager. She wrote a bunch of poetry lamenting that she didn't want to do what girls were expected to do. She didn't want to spend her time putting on dresses, makeup. presenting herself to boys, to young men. And so she decided from a young age that she wouldn't do this. But it wasn't yet obvious to her what she would do. She knew she wanted to spend her life in books if that was at all possible. Her uncle had left her his library after he had died, and so she had all of these texts with her. And then, around age 22, she decided that she was going to take a big risk, and she went to London, which was like a 2-week journey by carriage. And as a single woman, that actually was quite dangerous. There were a lot of highwaymen, a lot of robbers along the road, and she had very little money in any case, and very few contacts in London. So this was incredibly risky for her to do. She arrives, and she starts to meet people. She sends people notes on scraps of paper. Famous bishop, she says, please, will you fund my work? Will you support me, support my poetry, support my writing? And he does, and so she starts to form this community, and she does something that no woman before her had done, which is she started to make a living as a woman writing philosophy. There was one woman who had made a living as a writer before her, Aphra Bain, and she wrote plays. There were some women who actually were doing philosophy, but they were aristocrats, so they didn't have to worry whether their work succeeded or not. And so she started to find patrons and to write, and one of her first works is this kick-ass treatise, and it's called A Serious Proposal to the Ladies. And when I read that, one day, when I was trying to find a topic for my dissertation, and I came across a text with this title, In Early Modern Philosophy, I was struck. I was like, wow, what is this? What is this about? And so the text is a proposal. It's in a sense an invitation for women to come and study and to learn. In the 17th century in England, women were not allowed to go to university. They were not going to school. Astel was lucky that she had a tutor. So there was very little support. And on top of that, the science of the day was saying that women were not, they were biologically inferior to men. So they were carrying on with these ancient ideas of their inferiority. So she had a lot against her. And she wanted women to take a risk and come and do this and live the life of the mind.
Amazing. I hope I can ask you to read a little bit, just
Sure.
because I want to give people the people who haven't read the book yet. I just want to give people a sense of the language of the book because it's so beautifully written. So let's go to our second philosopher. Maybe talk a bit about her, set her up, and then just read a little bit of.
course.
I just flagged something, but read anything you want, just to give us a taste.
So Damaris Mashem lived a very different life from Mary Astel. She was born in 1659. She grew up on the grounds of Cambridge University, and her father was a relatively famous philosopher, Ralph Cudworth, and he taught at a college at Cambridge. And so from a very young age, she was exposed to things that, most people never would be exposed to. Scholars, brilliant minds walking around. But she was in ways discouraged from also studying philosophy, and she wrote about this. It's never clear who discouraged her, if it was a particular person or just generally the case, but she did write about feeling discouraged. And when she got to be the age of, in her early 20s actually, she went to a Christmas party and she ran into a famous philosopher, John Locke. And he saw her. She's this very hot, young, less than half his age, brilliant woman, and he immediately was drawn to her, and he wrote her a letter after they met, and it was relatively flirty. And so she wrote back, sort of saying, I'm not so sure about you, guy, but maybe. And they carried on this correspondence for a long time. And it was very flirtatious, very romantic. It was clear that Damaris wanted Locke to propose to her, and he never did. There was no need to. He was living a wonderful life as an intellectual. It was great for men to be single at the time. It was considered to be the sort of the model to not have a wife or to bother with household, anything having to do with the household as a man. So in any case, Mashem wanted to marry him, didn't, ended up marrying someone else, and moved into a beautiful house. She married a lord, and so she became a lady. And about a decade later, Locke moved in with them. And we don't know really how her husband felt about that. But she had a great time thinking through ideas, and he was very supportive of these ideas, and she did end up writing a couple of pretty remarkable treatises. Okay, so here's some of her ideas. She believed that women were as smart as men, but had a greater capacity for empathy, making them better suited to raise children. And I quote, "For that softness, gentleness, and tenderness, natural to the female sex, renders them much more capable of than men are of such an insinuating condescension to the capacities of young children, as is necessary in the instruction and government of them, insensibly to form their early inclinations." Unquote. I don't see Mashem calling all women to be mothers in these passages. Rather, she appears to be asking current and potential mothers to take their post seriously, because as she views it, it is not a job that men can do as well. This insistence on women's superior capacity for care, which Astel also described, bothers me as it further entrenches patriarchal views, but it also has a few radical implications. It's why Mashem thought that women ought to be the arbiters of parental decisions in the domestic sphere. And here again she breaks from Locke, who insisted that fathers should be the ultimate judge in any domestic dispute. Her heightened respect for home life anticipated modern feminist laws that support the rights of mothers and attempt to curb domestic violence.
All right, relevant. Okay, let's move on. I know we're gonna have a lot of questions, I think, so I'm gonna open it up fairly soon. But could you talk about Mary Wollstonecraft?
Sure. So raise your hand if you know who Mary Wollstonecraft is.
What did she do?
What book did she write? Her famous book is A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, and I knew that going in. And so she's not a nearly forgotten person, but she is a nearly forgotten philosopher. Most people don't think of her as a philosopher, but in fact she was profoundly influenced by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. She considered herself a philosopher. She talked about it. She wrote about it in letters to her sisters, insisting that she be taken seriously as a philosopher. And an example of women's erasure, her husband, after she died, in his memoir, he remembers her not as a philosopher, not as Jean-Jacques Rousseau, not as like a Jean-Jacques Rousseau, but more like a poet, like Goethe, the German poet. And which I always found so offensive and strange, because she wrote political treatises, she wrote philosophical works, she wrote novels, just like Rousseau. Rousseau wrote novels too. But still, it was like in the mind of her husband, who was a philosopher also, William Godwin, she didn't quite fit the box, I think, because she was a woman. But they had an actually otherwise very supportive relationship. And that's part of what I find so compelling about Wollstonecraft, is this sort of complicated life she leads, and I think most women do, but this sort of complicated relationship with a man. How can you be free and be in love and have a healthy, strong heterosexual relationship? And she struggled with this. And at the end of her life, she was writing a book called The Wrongs of Woman, which was sort of a continuation of The Rights of Women. But The Wrongs of Women just continues the discussion of the ways in which women are hindered from becoming fully free. And she describes this wife who wishes to study, who wishes to expand her mind, and she has a husband who's not sympathetic to this. And she was very proud of this work. It was in progress, and she shared it with a couple of people who she trusted One was her husband, William Godwin. Another one was her friend, something Dyson. And Dyson read it, and he said he thought it was not very good. He just said, no, this is there's nothing interesting here. There's nothing new. What's going on? She's like, how can you say this? This is a woman, and we're talking about her subjectivity. We're talking about her mind. These are things that we should be caring about, that you should care about, that you should have sympathy for, just as you have sympathy for your own intellect, for the intellect of your friends. But it's like he couldn't imagine that. He couldn't take that imaginative leap that women would desire to live and to think as profoundly as a man would. And that frustrated her so much. So then she handed the manuscript to Godwin, and she's like, what do you think, honey? And Godwin was like, there's so many grammatical mistakes in this. And she went to bed and like didn't come out for a couple of days, and then got grammar
Also relevant
lessons.
and relatable. Yeah. This is great. Okay, well, we're running out of time rapidly, so I just want to ask, first of all, just Coburn, maybe don't read, maybe because,
I know, I'm just gonna blab and blab.
It's so good, it's so interesting and so fun. I want you to read us the whole book, but maybe just tell us quickly about Coburn. I'm going to ask another question, and then I'm going to turn it over, because I want to hear what everybody else wants to know about and not monopolize you.
So Catherine Coburn, she was this really interesting individual who, when she was a teenager, she wrote a novel defending the freedom of conscience of women. So imagine a teenage girl doing this. And she did it because young teenage girls were being married off to much older men, and she wanted to make sure that these young girls had a say in what was happening in their lives. And so in the novel, it's the young girl talking and interacting with these gentlemen as a proper rational interlocutor. And so it was sort of a mind-blowing thing, and she was about 13 or 14 when she wrote this. And after that, she went on to write a number of plays. She was in the theater scene in London, did very well, and also took quite a battering too, and it got to be a bit too much, and so she set that aside, and she went on to write philosophy. But her message was the same throughout, which was free women's minds. Women need to have the freedom of conscience, not just to go about their daily lives, not just to earn salvation, but also to enjoy the pleasures of the mind, just as men do.
So 2 quick questions for me, and then your turn. How would you remake a philosophy program now, or a class? What would you do to make it more comfortable and fulfilling for the people like you were back when you were first studying?
That's a good question. We definitely simply need more people of color and more women in philosophy programs. There are not very many, so that absolutely should happen. And I think that will change what sort of questions are considered philosophical. Because if you look at philosophy programs, often the questions that concern women and their improvement in their condition, or people of color, these classes are considered to be electives, and which I find very strange. Why are these electives? Why aren't these central questions to ethics? Aren't these human questions? So that would be one thing. And looking at the history of philosophy, I think about this a lot. Well, I'm introducing these 4 women to a general audience, and what is my hope? What is my intention for them? I'm not saying I would, that they're on par with Plato or Descartes or Immanuel Kant. I think they're very different. I don't think they've had that sort of level of, participation in that world to reach that level. They haven't had that support. But I also don't think it's simply an answer to that would be to integrate them into the current canon as it exists. I think many of them are asking questions and thinking about things that require us to crack open the canon as such and really ask new questions. And so I would reshape the canon itself.
Amazing. Okay. Final question is, how is your life different? You moved here, age 31, newly divorced, had not published a book, and now here you are. And I see a front row teeming with amazing family members, and this whole room full of people. Can you just say briefly, what is it like now? Did you, in trying to figure out how does a person live, did you crack the case?
I cracked it, man.
Well done. All right. Thank you so much. Now I'm going to turn it over to everybody else who has questions. I think there's one in the back. Yes. Hello.
Hi. Congratulations, Regan.
Thank you, Raj.
My question to you really is around these individuals like you sort of surfaced and their intellectual pursuits. Were they very much focused on gender and sort of position of women in society, or were they much more broad, like you mentioned Rousseau and Descartes and others who really thought very broadly in many different sort of areas of intellectual pursuit?
I'm going to restate the question for our audience at home. Correct me if I'm wrong on this, but so were these philosophers mostly interested in women's issues, as it were, or sort of more broadly?
Thank you. It's a great question. So I think it depends on the philosopher. Mary Astel had a very broad philosophy. She was interested in epistemology and metaphysics. She was weighing in on the questions of whether we can know the human soul and the relationship between the body and the soul, and those sorts of things that Locke and Descartes were very passionate about also. She also was interested in the condition of women. And Damaris Mashem, her works, Discourse Concerning the Love of God, was a work of metaphysics and knowledge and epistemology. So she was interested in those questions too, in the way of ideas. She was an empiricist. She defended this idea that all ideas come to us through sensation and reflection, and that there are no innate ideas. But the force of her work, the main points of both of her two small treatises, is a defense of the minds of women and also the dignity of mothers. Catherine Coburn is different. Her feminist work is primarily in her novel and in her plays and in her private letters. Her philosophy is essentially a defense of John Locke's theories. And Mary Wollstonecraft is mostly, I would argue, a feminist philosopher. But there were many women who were just doing metaphysics, right? There were a ton of those that weren't even talking about the condition of women around that time.
Excellent. Okay, who is next? Yes, in the front row.
So,
Make it easy. It better be an easy question.
how long was the process from beginning to end of making the book?
Good question. For the people at home, that young man in the front row asked, how long was the process, beginning to end, of doing this book?
That's a very good question.
Did you want to answer this question?
You might be able to. So it started, when did it start? I mean, there are many starting points. I knew when I was writing my dissertation, right, which was between the years of 2004 and 2007, I knew I would do something more with them. I wanted to. I wanted to share them with the wider world. But I didn't it didn't really come together. I wasn't sure how to tell that story until later. And it became clear to me around 2016 that I needed to include myself into this book, that my personal experience was, and why these women resonated with me as part of this larger story of the erasure and the suppression of women's voices in philosophy. So, but I started writing it truly in 2018, so that's, and what is it, March 2023? You know, so there you go.
Appears. Yes. Who is next? Over here? Yes.
So my question is, as you were finding out information about all these women, how did you fill in the blanks with what you didn't know? Did you try to imagine what they were thinking and try
So the question was, how did you fill in the blanks? Because there, of course, there were many. You went quite far back in history, and how did you create a story?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you. Well, so I didn't want to invent. I was, this is nonfiction. I'm very passionate about that and what that means to me. And so there was no invention, but I like to think of it as a triangulation. And so what I mean is that I did a lot of work in secondary literature and in looking through personal letters, looking through the letters of the individuals that were living in the same context as them, looking at history, looking at cultural currents, trying to get a feel for what a woman would be thinking at that time, right? Because it's really hard to paint a picture of female subjectivity when it's just been so violently removed. And so I would use those different sources, those little pieces, and with the intention that obviously there are intentions here, so what is it? And that was the process that I used, yeah.
That's great. Okay, I think there was one over here a second ago. Oh, go ahead.
So, first of all, thank you for compiling all this for all of us, like what every male philosopher thought about women, etc. It was like, and sometimes you bring in an interpretation that felt powerful, and I was applauding as a woman. But having written this, like done all this research, etc., do you think women and men think differently, or like, is there such a thing as how to think like a woman, or like, is it because we've been living in patriarchy? Is it a reactional? I mean, like, I don't know.
So the question is, there's praise, and then do men and women think differently?
It's a great question. I love this question. The title of my book is How to Think Like a Woman, right? So, spoiler alert, you're not gonna know, right, from me. Like, I don't know. And in fact, I am pretty adamant that I will not, I don't believe it's really possible. I think the question of how to think like a woman presupposes the nature of woman, or sort of the conditioning of woman. And it's a mystery that I find to be very similar to what does it mean to be a human. And that too is a big mystery. So the title of my book is very much tongue-in-cheek, right? We've been told for a long time how we think, and it's pretty consistently derogatory. So I wanted to play with that. I wanted to deconstruct it, and I wanted to begin to show that these other people who we call women actually have very different ideas about what it means to think like a woman. Like Mary Astel and Damaris Mashem don't agree about it. There are some general things they might share, like they believe that God is good and God expects women to use their reason, but Mary Astel, wants them to be single. She wants them out of the house. She wants to break the mold. And Mashem, there's a bit of calling them back into the home in a dignified way, like women rule the roost at home, right? But those are very different conflicting ideas. And I don't know what it means to think like a woman.
That's great. Okay, we have a bunch of questions. How much time? We've got another few minutes, so just got time for a couple more. Okay, yes, you first, please.
I'm curious, we talk a lot about how like Rousseau and Kant and Locke inspired the Atlantic revolutions and how democracies were based on their ideas. Have you ever fantasized about like what the world would be like if these women's voices were realized and were heard during this time, and how things might be different?
Fun question. Do you ever fantasize about what the world would be like if women's voices were listened to?
Like during the Enlightenment,
during the Enlightenment specifically, yes.
I do. I don't think there would be something called postmodern studies. Like it would have happened. In the Enlightenment, there were critiques of the Enlightenment, right? There were people saying, these women, for example, we really didn't get much into the philosophy, but now you have to read the book to find out. But Mary Astel, for example, was critiquing Thomas Hobbes, who argued that all humans are, equal by nature, and they have these equal rights. And she also was critiquing John Locke for inalienable rights, just this emphasis on rights. And part of that problem she saw was that it was selfish, essentially, right? It didn't really. Why do you have a right? It seemed more like license, and her concern is that people would lose a sense for their community, to their obligations to one another, right? Which is a theme that you hear about, more contemporary critiques of Enlightenment thinking.
Great. Okay, there was somebody in the back who was, yes, hello.
Hi, thank you so much for this. This was wonderful. I have two questions. One is, what did you want to inspire in your readers with your book, especially for those of us who have not had the pleasure to study philosophy after high school? And the other one was, I look at the constituency of the audience. It's very largely women. Is the target audience you had in mind largely female or both?
So 2 questions. What did you want to inspire in people, especially non-philosophers? And also, is your audience mostly women?
Well, my reader, I think it kind of was a woman, yeah. I do. My heart, it goes out to women, and then, but I do want men to read this too so badly. I really, really do, because and this is another point that these 4 women philosophers make, is that things will not change for women if men are not sympathetic, right? If there's a lack of sympathy for women's condition, then nothing will improve. And the case the book is making is that stance isn't just lazy, it's unethical. So there's that. But I think the book is, what I really want someone to come away with, Juliet, is like this idea that a pride, actually. Like, it's pretty amazing that the history of philosophy is not the field of dead white men. It's not. Actually, there were women from the beginning, right? And I'm thinking of the beginning in Indian philosophy. That's where it was at, 2500 BC, right? There were women doing philosophy then. And there were women doing philosophy when the Greeks were doing philosophy. There were people of color, right? So the field of philosophy is not the field of dead white men. I mean, that is pretty significant, and I feel inspiring, and that is, even if you don't study philosophy, to know that about humanity and about civilization seemed pretty important.
That's great. 2 more?
Yeah.
Okay, I think we have to go to the front row again, I'm sorry.
Which one out of the 4 is your favorite?
Which of the 4 is your favorite is the question. You have to choose, and I think also which of your children.
No. I'm going to answer it right now, but it might change tomorrow, okay? I'm going to say Mary Astel. Mary Astel, definitely. She really got me in graduate school when I felt isolated and alone. We're the only women in the program, unsure if I wanted to continue with my PhD, and here she was saying, form a community. You need to build a community of support network. The dudes were great at that. Even Socrates was doing that, and you need to do that too. And so yeah, that's just a powerful message, and one that really stuck with me. And right now it's a good one too, as I launch this book into the world, to remember my community.
Okay, speaking of community, as a debut author, I feel like, and many of you might not have had friends or loved ones publish a book before, so quick etiquette, you should buy multiple copies of the book, each of you. And also it's good to shop.
No pressure.
To shop, because Books Are Magic is a wonderful bookstore, and we love it here, and so we want to support them too. So buy lots of copies of Regan's book, and then lots of copies of other books as well. You can
And it is book.
Don't worry about me.
Books.
Take take cute pictures of her and post them. Make sure you check with her first that she likes them. What are some other Okay, thanks. Yes, have her sign your book and have her sign books to all the other people you buy it for, and then you can get all your Christmas shopping done now.
It is such a pro, right? I mean, wow.
I've been there, and it's really exciting time. It's a nerve-wracking time, having your first book out. But it's going to be all good from here and all fun from here, because you wrote something really fantastic that's going to have a lot of impact for many years to come. So I think we're getting the signal. We should stop now, go buy all the books, and then she'll be signing in the back there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you all so much for being here.
Yeah, give it up for these two fantastic authors. Yes, as Ada so brilliantly just said, we have many additional copies available for purchase tonight, as well as Ada's most recent book, Also a Poet, which is fantastic. So as Ada also just said before, Regan's going to be signing in the very back desk. So we do ask that once you've purchased your books, etc., that you gather all of your personal belongings and make your way downstairs so that our staff can start to rearrange the space. If you're still with us on the YouTube live stream, you can buy Regan and Ada's books by clicking the link in the live stream description. All right, that's all. Let's give it up one more time for these two.